So I want to talk in this section of the lecture about the foreign policy of the new French Fourth Republic. What was the overriding policy concern for the French after 1945? Obviously, it was Germany. So we have this little stereotypical image of Germany here. German armies had invaded France 3 times in the previous 70 years. There was a very strong determination upon the part of the French people to ensure something like that did not happen again. And the obvious solution that many people had was, well, all of France's problems began when Germany reunited as one country, or at least as it was building towards reunification. The obvious solution was, well, maybe Germany should be divided. As it happened, France was actually going to get its way, albeit by default as opposed to actual intent and design. Bear with me 1 second. I just want to press. Here we go. So in 1945, in the wake of the defeat of Germany, as I'm sure you're all aware, the Allied powers divided Germany up into 4 sections: a British section, an American section, a Soviet section, and kind of as a form of concession, there was also a French section as well. I mean concession because obviously, as we already saw in the previous video, France was not considered one of the main Allied powers. But France was given a section of Germany to control for itself. There was also given the Saarland. So this is the Saarland here. France was to be allowed to, let me just get the mouse. This is the Saarland. France had also occupied this region after the First World War. It was one of the most important industrial regions of Germany. Again, it was given to French administration in 1945, with potentially the prospect that it could be unified with France some stage in the future. In 1955, with the actual support of the German government, a referendum was held in Saarland on whether Saarland would become an independent nation. And it was, I think it was 66% of the voters rejected that idea, which was largely seen as a sign that the Saarland citizens wanted to return to Germany. And that wish was actually honoured, although that's a little bit further down the line. You can see Germany itself lost territory. This here, what used to be old Eastern Prussia, that all got pushed into the new Poland because the Soviet Union essentially annexed part of Eastern Poland and compensated Poland by giving it new territories in the West. The idea was this division was supposed to be temporary, but as the tensions of the Cold War increased, it became permanent. So by late 1940s, it was starting to become obvious that the Germany would not be united as a single country anytime soon. So here, essentially, what we get is that the three areas controlled by the French, the British, and the United States were merged into a single country that became the Federal Republic of Germany, a democratic state, and East Germany, which was under Soviet control, established the German Democratic Republic, a communist satellite state in Eastern Europe. And yeah, a lot of people in France were not too upset about this outcome. I mean, for them, the problem had always been a strong, united Germany. A divided Germany, they felt was something they could deal with more readily. As the Nobel Prize-winning French author François Mauriac commented once, "I love Germany so much, I am glad there are 2 of them." So a lot of French people were reasonably content with the fact that Germany, again, albeit kind of by accident, but remained divided after the war. France also ended up becoming part of the new North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. Initially, the French weren't overly keen on becoming part of a united effort in Europe, especially with American influence. Even though de Gaulle himself was not empowered, there certainly was a great deal of skepticism in France about too much undue American influence in Europe. But in the wake of the Soviet Union essentially putting a blockade upon the city of Berlin, starting in 1948, the French realized that they basically felt the Soviets might have aggressive intentions for Western Europe. It was better to be united with the United States and other powers, and so France joined NATO when it was established in 1949. In fact, here is your trivia question. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, formed in 1949, has its headquarters in this city. Anyone know? Well, the answer is Brussels. However, so while France might have gotten what it wanted in terms of establishing or ending up with a divided Germany, a potentially much weaker Germany that had existed before, there were some people in France who figured that the mistakes of the past need to be avoided, and that perhaps the best way to ensure there was no future conflict with Germany was to find a way to work with the Germans. And the most influential advocate in this regard was Robert Schuman, who was a leading French statesman, became prime minister for a time in the Fourth Republic, and he was a big believer that France needed to reach out to Germany and try and work with Germany in order to create a kind of more peaceful relationship between the two nations. He was agreed in this, or he found a willing ally in the form of the German Chancellor of West Germany, Konrad Adenauer, who also believed that the mistakes of the past were the divisions, essentially that divisions between France and Europe had led to two destructive wars in Europe in the previous 25 years, and that some form of greater union between them would be of considerable benefit to both countries. And so it was under the influence of Adenauer and Schuman, amongst others, that the European European coal and steel community was established between the six nations of Western Europe. So we have West Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, France, and Italy. Essentially create a free trade area between the six nations where coal and steel can be traded without any kind of tariffs. This obviously is the precursor to what eventually becomes the European Union. And so France was an active participant in that from the very beginning. And it was considered a considerable success. Some French people wanted to go further. There was a proposal to establish something called the European Defence Community in the early 1950s, and what this basically was an idea that it would form all the armies of Europe essentially would combine or put together an armed force made of soldiers of their various different nationalities to serve as an anti-Soviet deterrent in the face of Soviet invasion. What was really about the reason was it was actually proposed by the French government. A guy called René Plavin was the French foreign minister, and he kind of realized that, look, it's inevitable that the Germans would be allowed to form an army again. In fact, the United States was already pushing that we need to have a reconstituted, strong Germany in order to act as a potential ally against the Soviet Union. And so what Plavin was kind of hoping for was that this would be a way of allowing Germany to rearm to an extent, but keeping it within a wider European controlled implement, as opposed to allowing the Germans to have their own independent army. It created outrage in some parts of France. Some people essentially didn't like the idea of French kind of independence, even though the French government had proposed it, rejected the idea of French independence that would be compromised by the creation of this European defence community. So you can see the two cartoons here. The one on the left is kind of the EDC was shot down and was buried due to French protests, and this is a kind of idea that this was not a good idea. The cartoon on the right, you see the idea of the European Common Defence being a knife driven into the head of Marianne, representing France, a kind of negative take on the proposal. So France, to the forefront in trying to create, or at least laying the foundations for what we now know to be a much more united federal Europe, or the beginnings of federal Europe. But some things worked well, like the coal and steel community. The EDC obviously was not quite as successful. I want to show you a couple of stamps, and the next question we're going to talk about is the French Empire. So this was something issued by the government of France, a stamp issued in 1940, prior to the fall of France. You see the idea of France and overseas France, the emphasis being placed on the empire, especially the French Empire in West Africa and in Indochina. The Vichy government actually issued a very, very similar stamp once they came into existence. And again, the idea being that there's this trying to reinforce the message of this union between France and its overseas territories and stressing its importance. And the new provisional government, I mean, this one's not quite as clear, but the same idea, also published an almost identical stamp in 1945. So all these three very different regimes were trying to promote the idea of a French empire that would have influence on, or a French empire that would be of mutual benefit to both France and its colonies. But of course, the question after the First World War, there were questions being raised about the necessity for empire. Traditionally, what had justified the empire? What had justified a French republic supposedly based on democratic principles, conquering other territories and administering them as colonies? And essentially had been racism and the language of civilization. The idea was, well, this was for the benefit of these of different, who are non-white people. They need the kind of guidance of a steady white hand, and therefore that justified all of that. The problem is, after the Second World War, that sounds kind of like a lot what the Nazis were saying, that racialized national language, and therefore that made that language kind of far less suitable for justifying the French Empire. But if that didn't justify the French Empire, then what did? And so in 1946, the Fourth Republic proclaimed a new union, a French union. Essentially, it gave equal rights to all the people in the French Empire, justifying that they are all essentially equal French citizens. So it abolished the old law of the indigenous that mandated that essentially the colonial governors would kind of govern as they fit and override the rights of the colonized populations and not treat them as French citizens. They all were now to be French citizens, and steps were taken to create greater local government within the empire as well, although not specifically independence. So the French Union kind of replaces the French Empire in 1946. That was received differently in different parts of the empire. The biggest challenge for the French came in Vietnam, what had been French Indochina. So during the war, Ho Chi Minh, who as we saw spent time in France in the early decades of the 20th century, had led a communist revolt against Japanese rule. Once the Japanese withdrew from Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh essentially declared Vietnamese independence. Charles de Gaulle's government sent soldiers into Vietnam to try and reclaim the colony for France. They conquered much of the southern part of the country. The northern part of the country remained in the hands of Ho Chi Minh. The question became what would the French do in terms of how to deal with Ho Chi Minh. There were some people who advocated, and actually there had been a deal negotiated, that Ho Chi Minh's Vietnam would join with the South, would essentially become semi-independent but would remain within the French Union. However, the more militant aspects of the French Empire Army insisted that they could defeat Ho Chi Minh, and so what resulted was the French Indochina War. That is a war between the French and the Vietnamese, starting in 1947, where the French tried to reconquer North Vietnam. However, by 1949, the French essentially had recognized the complete independence of South Vietnam, and a lot of people were kind of confused, well, what exactly are we fighting for? We've already given up the principle that Vietnam can be independent. Then what are we trying to conquer North Vietnam for? In other parts of the empire, however, the French did put down rebellions. There was a rebellion in Madagascar after the Second World War that the French had pretty brutally repressed. Perhaps up to 80,000 people were killed in the efforts to bring Madagascar back under French control. There were similar efforts in Algeria. There had been an attempted uprising in early 1945 that had been defeated, and then the French government, the offer they essentially made in 1947 to Algeria was to create a parliament that would be partly elected by the French colonists in Algeria, partly elected by the indigenous Muslim population. So it's with the idea that being no laws could change without the consent of 2/3 of the majority of the people in Parliament. What that effectively meant was that the 900,000 or so French settlers in Algeria would be able to veto anything that the 8 million indigenous people of Algeria would want to bring about, and it was rejected by the various nationalist groups in Algeria. When elections were held, the French governor manipulated the elections to ensure that loyal Arabs or loyal Algerians were put in important positions on the half of the chamber that was controlled by the indigenous Muslim population. So France is still struggling and trying to reconcile its efforts to keep Algeria in the empire, keep Algeria part of France, which of course is what it was, with the growing demands among French Algerian nationalists for independence, full independence from France.